But thank you very much for coming and braving the heat out there and some of the traffic issues, I think. So tonight, well, let me start by saying thank you to Grant Thornton for the sponsorship for this evening, for both the venue and for the food that we'll have around about 8 o'clock. We'll start with some of the buffet. And in terms of fire exits, looks like that's one way, there's another way that way, there's nothing planned, so if there is a fire, follow me. Anyway, but thank you very much for coming. And what I'd really like to do is, so William has very kindly come along this evening to do a presentation on 5G and talk about his book, The 5G Myth, of which there are a few copies for sale as well, but he can talk about more of that later. But I first met William in about 2013 when he was working for, or he was one of the founders of a company called Newell over in Cambridge, which later was acquired by Huawei. But he's definitely one of the key people in this whole Internet of Things 5G space. So very significant, a number of roles, working for, yes, he's the CEO of the Weightless SIG, and I'm sure he'll explain more about that later. He's also been a leading member of the IET, the IEEE, and has a whole variety of number of papers that he's written over the time, and he has a number of visiting doctorates from a number of universities. But really pass it over to William, and over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. So yes, 5G, and hopefully an entertaining critique of everything I think that's wrong in the 5G world. It'll take me about 30, 35 minutes to do that. I suggest perhaps the best thing is to save questions till afterwards, because it kind of builds to a logical conclusion, so it's easier to then pick up thoughts and questions. Hopefully a lively discussion. Hopefully moderately entertaining. I've tried to keep it a bit lighthearted, but with some critical points in there. And as Tony said, actually based on some thinking that I've been developing over quite a while, but put together into a book that was published in November of last year, and that has gone down reasonably well. So 5G. 5G is somewhere out there in the future. The future is, of course, pretty hard to predict. Can we predict it? So most people would say in the world of telecoms, in the world of ICT, it's pointless to try and predict more than 5 years out. That it's just too uncertain, there's too much going on, stuff happens so quickly, it's impossible to have any kind of a future prediction. So I have, in fact, been making predictions of the future for quite a while, including this book, which isn't for sale here, but I think you can still get it on Amazon, which was written in 2000. And in the book, I actually made some very specific projections for 5, 10, 15, and 20 years hence. So one for 2015, one for 2020. So let me just remind you a bit about what the world looked like in 2000. That was the best-selling phone. I know it's making a comeback. And it was a good phone. But that was it. That was the pinnacle of what you could do with a mobile. And people were trying vaguely to do internet browsing with WAP. Remember that? It was a complete failure. The idea of using your phone for anything much more than a voice call or a rather painful text using that T9 thing with your numbers and digits and so on, that was really about it for mobile phones. Google hadn't really yet emerged. It was kind of in existence, but it hadn't got any of its key patents around. And here in the UK, by 2001, we were just starting to get ADSL for the lucky few, but most of us still had that funny old dial-up thing. Remember, it used to make sort of happy chirping noises for about 30 seconds, and then if you were lucky, you got about 30 kilobits a second. So that was the world at the point when I made the predictions in 2000. So what did I say? So these are all the things I said, and I color-coded them. I color-coded them green with things that we can do, orange with things that we can't quite do, but I think we will by 2000, and red for anything I got wrong, except there's no red. That's not bad, is it, actually? And in fact, one of the ones I'm most pleased about is this, average data rates to the home of 60 megabits a second. So that was predicted at a time where 60 kilobits a second was actually pretty impressive. And that's not far off what BT deliver now, for those of you who are lucky enough to be connected to BT's sort of fiber to the cabinet kind of product. And actually, some of these, it's interesting, some of these now sound obvious, like pre-order coffee nearest Starbucks, ready for collection on arrival, provide directions to get there. Yeah, why not? But actually at the time, the idea of being able to pre-order was pretty impressive. Directions, way out of it. So I would contend that you can predict the future. You can do fairly well. Okay, so I didn't predict anything that didn't happen. What didn't I predict? Well, I didn't say much about social media. You might say that's a pretty big flaw, really, given the role of social media in our world today. Yes, probably. But I would contend, actually, that I talked a lot about using the phone for communications with people. I just didn't specifically say it's going to be through a platform that looks like Facebook. I said it was going to be a mix of voice and video and interaction and so on. So I'm not going to beat myself up too much about that. I didn't predict Pokemon Go, but then again, Pokemon Go has been and gone. Although, interesting point as a complete aside, but we'll come back to this. So Pokemon Go, of course, at its pinnacle was an enormous phenomenon, augmented reality. Any guesses as to the volume, the increase in volume of traffic on the cellular network caused by its peak? 0.1%. 0.1%, almost nothing. And the reason for that is actually because all it does is, when you download it to your phone, but in the first case, it downloads all the character graphics. And then essentially, when you were out and about and you're in a particular location, the phone just says, oh, superimpose that graphic, you're on the right location. So the instruction from the network is simply superimpose graphic number 368. And that's all it needs to be. It's not any kind of video feed live from the network. So actually, not a lot of traffic loading on the network. This is an interesting one. You probably can't read it. What would you rather lose? This is compared to Wi-Fi access, but the concept is sort of similar. And I'm sort of struck by the fact that 21% would rather give up sex than Wi-Fi access. I didn't predict the phone was going to be quite so critical to our lives as that. And I didn't predict this either, which is also perhaps a severe problem that should have been picked up. The whole idea of hacking, denial of service, security, and of course that's growing all the time. So yeah, it wasn't a perfect prediction, a number of things that weren't ideal. But nevertheless, I would contend you can, if you're careful and both pragmatic and look at trends, make some pretty good predictions for what the world is going to be like 5, 10, even 15 years hence. So 5G. So should be easy, shouldn't it? We know what 5G is, don't we? Well, the community does. And you can see all those kind of things on the side there. By and large, it tends to focus around very high speed. So if you look at any sort of 5G headlines at the moment, they've tended to be, I've got a gigabit, I've got 10 gigabits, I've got 50 gigabits kind of thing. But more generically, those list of bullets there are broadly what the community talks about when it talks about 5G. And kind of roughly in the list of the headlines. So starting off with very fast speeds. And of course, that kind of makes sense because speed has been what has gone up incrementally from generation to generation. Very high levels of capacity. The aspiration is for a 1,000-fold increase in capacity to handle the ever-increasing volume of mobile data. Broadband everywhere, so ubiquitous of coverage. Massive machine connectivity, also known as Internet of Things, but sort of on steroids because it's 5G as opposed to any other kind of thing. And then this sort of concept that's crept in of incredibly low latencies, which could be useful for, well, nobody quite knows what, but kind of maybe some kind of remote control of your car with complete computer control of every car in the UK, all from some central point. Yes, we'll come back to that. Anyway, that's kind of the vision that's broadly been set out for 5G. And it's very confused. So you can go to any conference, even a 5G conference, and you'll hear quite different things from different people as to what they think 5G is, which, given that the Koreans say they're going to implement it next year, is a slight problem. We'll come back to that as well. Okay, so let's pick on each of those particular bullets one at a time. So each of the next few slides, I'll take each of those and talk a bit more about them. So let's start with speed. Speed. It's a great picture, isn't it? So this, of course, is all about speed. Now, imagine you were an analyst looking at the airplane industry, and imagine you were doing that at about the time that Concorde was about to be launched. You might have drawn a chart like this that shows years along the x-axis and speed of aircraft along the y-axis, and you could plot a nice line. It looks pretty good, doesn't it, from the DC-3 through Comet, through Concorde, and that's clearly a law, and you can extrapolate that, and certainly by the year 2010, you'll be traveling at about 2,500 miles an hour, and it'll take about 40 minutes to get to New York, won't it? Won't it? That's what's actually happened. In fact, all of the planes since Concorde are about the same speed as the Comet, really, not much faster. Concorde was a complete outlier. Any extrapolation based on Concorde would have been utterly nonsensical and would have made you bankrupt very quickly. So sometimes some of these laws break down. So what happened here? It wasn't that people didn't want to go faster. It was just the economics didn't play out. It was just too expensive to go fast, and most people, when they had to put their hands in their pockets, decided that actually going slow and paying less for it was probably where they wanted to be, and that's what they'd do. And in fact, along came in-flight entertainment, and it wasn't quite so bad, and that's the world we live in right now. So, you could argue it's not really a great example, but I think nevertheless it's important to realize that things don't carry on forever, and there are some other issues that might be relevant. Okay, so do we need speed in a mobile phone? Well, no, not really. So this is a chart that shows how long it takes to download a typical web page. Page load time is what PLT stands for in milliseconds, versus the bandwidth that you've got. And this actually holds true for fixed or mobile. It doesn't really matter. So what you see there is that when you get to about 4 or 5 megabits a second, the page load time doesn't improve any. So what's going on? Well, you're actually now constrained not by the speed of your connection, but by delays inherent in the TCP/IP protocols. And by the time it takes for each ping to get to the far-end internet server, which may be in the west coast of the US or something like that, and back again. And a page typically has anything between 30 and 100 elements to it. So when you download a page, all these bits of video and adverts and text and so on, all are fetched separately. So there's an inherent delay that sort of multiplies up by all those elements. So on your home or on your mobile, once you get beyond 4 or 5 megabits a second, your internet browsing experience won't improve any. You may have noticed that. So if you get an improvement in your home broadband, and there's just you at home, let's say, from about 10 megabits upwards, I contend that beyond the occasions when you download a large file, you won't notice much difference there. Video streaming to a handset is pretty perfect at about 1 megabit a second, given the size of the screen. And in fact, a number of mobile operators have now found they can throttle video to about 700 kilobits a second, and nobody notices. That kind of speed is sufficient for typical viewing experience on a handset screen. Now, maybe you've got a big screen or something, but that's not very usual for mobile. And you can see a quote there from a Boston Consulting Group survey that basically said, go beyond 1.5 megabits to the handset, nobody will notice any difference. So why do we want 100 megabits a second, a gigabit a second? Beats me. Apart from the fact you can download app updates even faster than you might have done before. There's no clear driver for that. And indeed, everyone I've asked as to, do you want faster speed, has almost always said, not really. What would that do for me? Not to my handset. Of course, to the home, that speed level is different. So 1.5 megabits a second would not be enough to the home, because there's lots of people that live there, because when you watch video, you watch it on a much bigger screen, so you need a higher resolution. And you tend to do things slightly differently. But it's probably only a factor of about 10 higher in the home per person, roughly. So 15 megabits per person in the home is probably pretty much enough. Got 4 of you in the home, 60 megabits. It's very unlikely you'd notice much improvement beyond that kind of data rate. So that's a bit of a flaw for 5G. If its main construct is because everyone wants a gigabit a second, and yet nobody's going to notice anything higher than 1.5 megabits a second, and the average speed in the UK is about 20 megabits a second for a good 4G connection. What are we doing this for? Okay, not speed then. Maybe it's all about capacity. After all, our volumes of data usage are going up by 50% or more per year on the mobile. So yes, we should need lots of capacity. So these are the capacity curves from Cisco's Visual Networking Index. It's called Cisco VNI, which is as close as there is to an industry standard set of predictions. It tends to predict the last year and the next 4 years, so it's a 5-year sort of rolling prediction that moves along year by year. You can see a few years forecasts overlaid there. They're all actually shaded down slightly, but they're not too far out. And yes, you can see what looks like exponential kind of growth going on. It does look like things are growing very quickly indeed. But are they? So exponential growth is when the rate of growth itself is increasing. And that means a curve that gets ever steeper. Actually, if you look closely, those curves aren't getting ever steeper. In fact, the rate of growth is actually decreasing. So we're still growing, but it's gone from being 100% a year to 70% a year to 50% a year. And if you extrapolate that forwards, you can fit effectively a regression line to Cisco's own forecasts of what's going to happen. You can see they're forecasting that by 2020, the rate of growth is about 35% a year. That's still a lot. I mean, imagine volumes of water going up by 35% a year or whatever. So not insignificant. But it's falling. So if that carries on, what happens? Well, you end up with a classic S-shaped curve, which of course we've seen so often. You end up with a curve that effectively eventually levels off. At some point, the growth stops. And that looks to be, just from a simple prediction, to happen in about 2027, something like that. Now 5G, well, when will it arrive? We don't really know. But I think most people would now think something like 2025 for volume usage. So yes, we might have a number of trial systems much sooner than that. But at a point in time where it's really doing some heavy lifting, where it really is taking a lot of the capacity load off of our existing networks, then probably something like 2025. Well, at that point, as you can see, there isn't a lot more growth happening. You need to solve your growth problem before you get there, not with 5G. When you get there, it's too late. So I would contend, actually, you don't need all that kind of growth. Now, interestingly, if you work out what this is, in terms of a per user, it's about 15 gigabytes a month, which is roughly 10 times higher than we're at now. On average, the average person in the UK uses about 1.5 gigabytes of mobile data a month. 15 gigabytes would allow you to do an hour a day of video on your mobile. That might not sound a lot, but actually think about it. And on your mobile, not connected to Wi-Fi. So you're going to spend an hour a day, whilst not in your home or your office, watching live video on your phone. Well, if you're commuting by train, for an hour each way, you might. But the average person, probably not. So that's a pretty big chunk of video consumption. If my forecast is wrong and things carry on growing, some people say, well, another factor of 10, that wouldn't be unreasonable. That would mean 10 hours of video on your mobile, not connected to Wi-Fi, per day. Well, we only watch, on average, 3 to 4 hours of video in total. So the fact that everyone in the UK is going to be watching 10 hours of video on their mobile seems pretty inconceivable to me. So actually, those numbers all seem to stack up from a point of view of usage. Now, people say, well, but we're all going to be doing virtual reality, and that's going to require super high definition video that's going to require 10 times the bandwidth, and we're going to be doing this for 4 hours a day or something. Don't really see that. And if you do, I would think most virtual reality would be in your home or similar. I'd hope you wouldn't try and do it whilst walking down the high street. And if it's in your home, it's probably on Wi-Fi. So that all seems to stack up to me. I don't think we're going to see a lot of growth out beyond about 2025, which is still a long way out. I'm not saying no growth from here on, but I am saying by the time we get to 5G, most of the growth has happened. And the Internet of Things? Well, we've heard all these forecasts of 50 billion devices globally, which I believe, actually, because that's 10 connected devices per person with a phone on the planet. Think about your own home. How many wirelessly connected devices do you have there if you count Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and garage door openers or whatever else you might have? I bet it's more than 10 already. So 10 per person of IoT devices doesn't sound at all unreasonable to me. So let's assume 50 billion. But those devices are sending almost nothing. Most of these are sensors sending a temperature reading or whatever. That's about a byte And we're not talking about kilobytes, megabytes, or gigabytes. It's a byte. Now, yes, it's packaged up to be 10 or 20 bytes long or something, but it's still tiny, tiny amounts of information, as you can see there. The total loading on the network, on today's network, is utterly insignificant. Now, there's all sorts of other issues like battery life and so on, so I'm not saying that this problem is solved, but what I am saying is that even if you add in all these connected devices, you don't add much loading to the network, unless you try ridiculously hard. Some people have said, well, my car can generate over 1 gigabyte of data a day and wants to send it. Well, yes, of course it could. If you monitor everything on the car, package it up into an enormous file every millisecond, and then send the whole thing, yes, you can generate 1 gigabyte. But would you want to, especially if you had to pay for it? So I think we need to look into those kind of things. Okay, so I don't think it's capacity either, not for 5G, not particularly. Coverage. Yeah, absolutely. This is our problem today. If you talk to almost anyone about their frustration with mobile connectivity, it's to do with coverage. It's very rarely to do with speed. And if I give this presentation in Cambridge, everyone moans about all the train lines from Cambridge into London, how terrible they are. But there's plenty of other examples of poor connectivity. And that's becoming more and more of a problem as we become more reliant on our phones. So you get out of your car, you use Google Maps to find where you're going, but you've got no connection. Problem. I still print out a paper map, but my daughter wouldn't. So once you start relying on connectivity, then you've got a real issue if you haven't got it. And of course, we are doing that more and more and more. So coverage, I absolutely agree, is a big problem. So is 5G going to fix it? I mean, it said it would, but how would you fix 5G? How would you fix coverage? Well, I think you do it with Wi-Fi and 4G. I don't think there's anything in 5G that helps you at all. So let's take a look at a few things. Trains. So coverage is happening on trains with Wi-Fi connectivity. It's slow, it's not particularly fast, but Eurostar's now got it. Some of the East Coast mainline trains have got it. There's sort of requirements on UK trains to gradually roll it out. There's still issues with backhaul connectivity, but it's starting to happen. So people are starting to get used to the idea that they might be able to use Wi-Fi on the train. It doesn't matter that there's not cellular because most people don't want to use voice anyway, and if they do, they can use voice over Wi-Fi using a voice dialer of some description, WhatsApp or so on. And that all works just fine, and even some of the cellular companies like EE now provide full voice over Wi-Fi connectivity that's transparent through the dialer. So actually, that works okay. Now, there's still some issues as to getting much better backhaul to the train carriages so you can get better Wi-Fi inside them. But you can see the sense of direction there. And indeed, it would be hard to reverse back out of that. So it would be hard to say to Eurostar, please take out all your Wi-Fi and put in 5G. They would say, why? Wi-Fi works just fine. We've invested all this money in it. And everyone's got Wi-Fi connected devices, whereas very few people have got cellular connected devices apart from their phone. No, this device is not cellular connected, but it is Wi-Fi. So that makes a lot of sense. And in buildings as well, of course, Wi-Fi makes perfect sense. There's Wi-Fi in most buildings now. It's quite unusual to find one that doesn't have Wi-Fi. The problem there, of course, is that you have to find the right network, you have to type in a password, or you click on I agree, or all that kind of stuff. But there's plenty of ways around that. There's technical standards that solve that problem. There's networks of Wi-Fi nodes, like BT Open Zone, that if you sign into one, you sign into them all kind of thing. So that sort of problem can be relatively easily solved, and again, can provide all the connectivity you need in a way that works, is happening, has happened. It would be very hard to remove. Wi-Fi is only good, though, for short range, of course. You can't cover rural areas, mountains, and so on. So what you need for that is something that has got long range, and long range means low frequency, and things like the use of 4G LTE in the 800 megahertz band, not bad solution for reasonably good coverage. And indeed, EE, for example, are now trying to roll out pretty extensive coverage as part of a contract they've got to provide service to the emergency services who are moving from cell phone systems across to 4G systems, and they're extending their network as a result of doing that. So that will improve coverage to some degree. But actually, if you really want great coverage in a country, you have to ask yourself, Why hasn't it happened already? Well, it's not economic because it costs mobile operators a lot and we don't pay for it. Even though we whinge about it, we don't particularly pay more for it. So that's the kind of thing where if the government really believes that we need it because it's important for societal needs or for the ability to call emergency services or whatever, then it essentially has to provide some kind of subsidy to achieve that. And of course, that's just what it does effectively with any other kind of utility provision. And so that's kind of how we get to large area coverage. There's nothing in 5G that particularly helps. So what would help? Something with a very long range. But 5G is so focused on speed at higher frequencies means shorter range. So actually 5G doesn't help you. So the concept of needing broadband everywhere is a great one. 5G doesn't have anything in it to help you actually achieve that. Wi-Fi integrated into cellular is pretty much the answer there. Okay, next was massive machine connectivity. As I said, it's easy. Technically, it's easy. We can do it right now. There's a number of standards. For example, in the cellular arena, there's a technology called narrowband IoT, NB-IoT. Vodafone are rolling it out just about now. It's like all these things taking a bit longer than hoped, but it's pretty much there. Big push from the cellular operators, from Huawei and a few other manufacturers, which will mean that there will be some kind of standard there. And there's also the on-license side of things, which is kind of the equivalent of Wi-Fi, but in the IoT space. As Tony mentioned, I represent a body called the Weightless SIG, a standards body that's developing a standard for that space. There's also some proprietary technologies. They're technically all fine, they do the job. It's just a case of getting inertia behind them, making them really happen. And these things do take time. It took a number of years before Wi-Fi suddenly ramped up. Similarly with Bluetooth. I think we'll get there with IoT. It's not anything that we need 5G to solve. And in fact, only in the last few weeks, the 5G community pretty much said, we're not going to do anything on IoT, we'll just pick up 4G IoT, and we'll call that 5G. So, okay, machine connectivity needed, but again, it's a 4G thing, not a 5G thing. That leaves one last claim for 5G. The need for ultra-low latency. So latency is the delay it takes from the point of time you send a message from your phone to the point you get an answer back. Measured in milliseconds, and it's come down a lot. So in 2G, the latency was about 500 milliseconds, half a second. With 3G, that came down to about 100, 150 milliseconds. With 4G, that's come down to about 30 to 50 milliseconds. But it depends on a lot of stuff. So the first thing you've got is the speed to get across the radio connection to a base station. Then you've got the trip from the base station to the edge of the mobile network. And then you've got the trip from that point to wherever it is you want to connect to within the internet. So the Amazon server or whatever it is that you're trying to ping. So if you look at a typical 4G latency of 50 milliseconds, what you find is that about 10 milliseconds of that is the radio. About 20 to 30 is in the operator's core network as it bounces its way through the base stations and the routers and other such things. And about 20 to 30 is in the external network. It depends entirely on whether there's a local server in the UK or nearby, or whether it's got to take a trip over to the States or whatever and back again. So 5G has said, well, we can get that latency down to a millisecond. What latency are they talking about? Well, they're talking about the radio interface latency. So that goes from 10 down to 1, if you're lucky. That's pretty hard to do. That takes your total latency down from 50 to 41. That's not a big achievement, really. In fact, you can do much better just by sorting out the core network and where the Amazon server is located and not worrying at all about 5G. So it's not very easy to do. But even if you could do it, what would you use this 1 millisecond latency for? Well, as I sort of hinted earlier, it's a little bit of a solution looking for a problem. And the problem that's being posited is that we all need to control autonomous cars to within a millimeter of their life with this sort of latency. But that just seems ridiculous to me, the concept that every autonomous car has this kind of central control. I mean, they're called autonomous because they're autonomous. It goes into a tunnel, loses connectivity. Does it stop and wait until somebody builds a base station? No. So it's got to be able to handle itself without that connectivity, in which case it doesn't need millisecond connectivity. It doesn't really help you very much. Even if you had it, the car's still got to be able to detect that child that suddenly runs out after a ball in front of the car and stop itself. So being able to know that there's another car at a junction and you're going to miss it by millimeters may be vaguely helpful, but doesn't really change things very much. So not great. And the bottom chart is a bit of a telling chart. So this is the revenue of the mobile phone industry. So we're kind of accustomed to think of these companies as really rich and powerful companies. And they were 20 years ago. But actually, if you look at what's happened in the last few years, the revenue growth has been flat or slightly negative. And this is global. It's actually been growing in developing countries and shrinking in developed countries. And the subscriber growth is non-existent. And in fact, somebody once said to me, imagine you were trying to do a pitch to an investor and you came along and said, please invest in this company. It's trying to raise a few $1 billion. It's a company which has got negative revenue growth and declining profitability. It needs to make an enormous capital bet over 15 years, for which the payback is uncertain. It's in a very tough regulatory environment where the regulator keeps clawing back more money. And there's no possibility whatsoever of exit through merger or sale because the regulator will prevent that. Can we have some money, please? You'd run a mile, wouldn't you? I mean, who would invest in that proposition? And that's the reason why cellular investment is at an all-time low in networks. The operators are trying to save money as best they can in an environment where ARPUs have not grown for quite some time and not expected to grow, and therefore any investment just detracts from their overall profitability. So it's not a time when they're actually that keen to invest a lot of money in rather speculative investments. Okay, so let's start to wrap this up then. So what's left? Well, we do need a 10 times capacity increase to take us to the peak of that curve that I showed you. And we need that delivered everywhere. And I can tell we can do that with 4G and Wi-Fi and a bit more spectrum that's coming out in the UK and other places, slight improvements in some of the 4G technologies that are coming along. We do need Internet of Things. We can do that with 4G, narrowband IoT, and unlicensed technologies. And that approach doesn't require the mobile operators to spend any more. They can deliver all of that without really any additional base stations. And some of the heavy lifting is done by Wi-Fi and other such things, which is investments from individuals and companies and so on in their own Wi-Fi. It does require a bit of government intervention, in particular to help improve coverage and perhaps to get the train companies to play ball. And governments have got some money for 5G. And in the budget back in August, the UK government earmarked about £1 billion for a mix of fibre and 5G, of which it was mooted that roughly 600 to 700 million will be fibre, 300 to 400 million 5G. And then they've come out with the 5G strategy, which is starting to look at ways they might spend that. So there is a bucket of money. Now, whether it still exists when they get to the point they want to spend it, who knows? But nevertheless, there's certainly a signal of some willingness to make some kind of investments. And DCMS and others have sort of said, actually, we want to spend this on 5G readiness, by which they kind of mean improving the networks with 4G to get to a point where you've got this kind of capability. So, okay, what is 5G? Well, it's not going to go away, that's for sure. But my take is, as you can see there, it's just anything that happens after 2018, we'll call it 5G. It won't really be 5G, it'll be 4G, narrowband IoT, Wi-Fi, all bundled together. But hey-ho, it doesn't really matter. It can be called 5G, and everyone will be happy. So what does that mean for government? It means some attention on spectrum for 4G, and particularly for Wi-Fi. And indeed, Wi-Fi is sort of often seen as the poor child of connectivity. But actually, in the UK, from your mobile phone, about 80% of the data it sends goes over Wi-Fi. If you add in all your other devices, about 98% of the data you send as a person goes over Wi-Fi. It should be Wi-Fi that is the forefront of our wireless technologies. The cellular is the kind of what we use when we can't get Wi-Fi connectivity, and not the other way around. So we need a bit of a refocus on that. And that means a refocus on the competition laws, Ofcom and the Competition and Mergers Authorities and others all tend to sort of look at the mobile operators, ignore everything else. That needs to switch around a bit so that we can get a more balanced environment, which will allow the mobile operators to adapt. And we need government, as I said, to pay for on-economic coverage. So, last slide. Who remembers that logo? That's a blast from the past. So, I don't want to sound gloomy. I don't think I'm being gloomy. All I think I'm saying is that there's a fantastic future out there. And even better, we don't need to wait 5G. We can do it now with technologies we already have. And that's even better because it's faster, it's less cost, and that's fantastic. So we don't need to focus on speed. We don't need to focus a lot on outdoor capacity. That's not where the problems lie. We do need a lot more Wi-Fi. We do need IoT solutions, and we need specific coverage improvements. And a viable regulatory environment that handles all of that. We've created a world where mobile connectivity is really important. Let's deliver on that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, William. I'm going to pass the microphone around if anybody's got any questions. But I wanted to start with saying my interpretation of 5G has been more in terms of adaptive bitrate technology, rather than just 5G is faster than 4G is faster than 3G. It's more about how do you use all the different media and formats. So it's almost, in my mind, 5G is coming together all of these different methods of communication, but into a whole. And that's not what you're saying. You're saying 5G is very specifically the telecoms.
So that concept of 5G would be a good one. Effectively, a network of networks that encapsulates all these things. Yeah. And to some degree, if you look at sort of the long list, it does have super fast broadband, but also machine connectivity and other things. So you could argue that's in that vision. But I would say, in fact, we're getting there via a kind of a route of having lots of different networks to suit these things. So our 2G, 3G, 4G, which handles everything from grandmothers that want to make emergency calls through to high-speed gamers, narrowband IoT being rolled out for that, Wi-Fi being available for other things. And those actually collectively give a lot of flexibility. And I can't see the need for anything else beyond that. So something that encapsulates all of those into a coherent system is great. And we're getting there with phones that already integrate Wi-Fi and cellular much more closely together. Yeah.
So is it just a different definition of what 5G means? If 5G is defined as something different, then that could be where we're going.
Yeah, I mean, and this in a way is the problem with 5G, that there is no clear definition of it. Really? So it can mean whatever you want it to mean. So go to a research lab and they'll probably say, well, it means a gigabit a second delivered using pencil beam antennas that steer around following mobiles. Yeah. Go talk to this kind of group and you've got your own views which aren't, which are very sensible, and I certainly buy into those. Talk to mobile operators and they might well say, well, it's a way of getting lots more capacity for us or something like that. Yeah. And indeed, go to the States right now and you'll find the major 5G activity is from Verizon and AT&T delivering fixed wireless to the home using millimeter wave antennas to deliver an alternative to a fiber to the home. Something completely different from any of this stuff. Yeah. That's its problem. It means so many different things to different people that you can't very easily say, well, that's what it is. And if nobody knows what it is, nobody knows how to deliver it. Okay. Or alternatively, everyone knows how to deliver it because it's anything you want it to be.
Okay, question, Stuart. We'll pass this around because we're recording this.
Yes, the microphone won't make you louder, but it will mean your question is recorded for posterity.
Yeah, thanks, William. My name's Stuart Newstead, run a telecoms consultancy, XO2, BT, all that kind of stuff. I would agree with particularly your point about 5G will be what people label it, and because there isn't a full definition, then you can make a claim and say, yeah, this is 5G, and nobody can disagree, so there's nothing to do that. So it's as if you take the label smart, which everything used to have, and stick a new label 5G on it.
Yeah.
It reminds me back when I led the very first launch of BlackBerry. When we launched it, it was BT Cellnet.
Yeah.
In the middle of launching it, we became O2. We had to peel off the BT Cellnet thing and
Yeah.
stick O2 on it. But my question is more just about the investment. And you kind of almost described a world where the bad things, you know, it's a declining growth for operators, like a bear running out of the woods.
Yeah.
And there's two guys running away from the bear.
Yeah.
And you're kind of describing a world where they both worry about being eaten by the bear.
Yeah.
But then there's the classic, one guy stops, puts on a pair of trainers. The other guy says, what are you stopping for? The bear you'll get us both. He says, no, I don't need to outrun the bear, I just need to outrun you.
Yeah.
So if I have an advantage now, I'm thinking about EE in the UK, for example, they have a spectrum advantage, they have a money advantage.
Yeah.
I might just think, well, I kind of know this 5G is bad for the industry, but it might not be bad for me.
Yeah.
And I just think you might get some of that like attempts at local optimization rather than an industry optimization.
Yeah.
A little bit like, you know, football clubs saying, look, I know there's a chance I'll be relegated, but it might be the other guy, so I'll spend a bit more on players, and that'll keep me going. I just wonder whether that might be something to think about for the world you're describing.
Yeah, I mean, and I think you're absolutely right. And mobile operators are desperately seeking some way out of their current flat revenue growth. And as you rightly describe, EE are actually taking a slightly different route, investing more and so on. I guess the thing you have to be careful of is that you don't invest in Concorde. So, you know, going out and saying, actually, I'm this wonderful airline and I'm going to buy lots of Concordes because that's going to make me faster than everyone else, it's just going to make you bankrupt rather quicker than everyone else. So it's got to be something that people actually want. And that's the trick, to invest in something that people will pay more for, or at least will go to you rather than someone else. And I'd argue EE are doing the right thing in improving their coverage. They're also trumpeting their speeds, of course, right now with the fastest network. And I think right now, you know, people's understanding of what makes good connectivity is understandably sketchy. I mean, it's quite difficult, of course. It's a combination of speed and latency and coverage and reliability and other such things, which most people don't even understand those terms, let alone the right balance that you need for any particular application. So speed is a simple proxy, but in the same way that we used to worry about speeds of cars, but now we're much more worried about whether it's got Bluetooth connectivity and leather seats, I think that will switch around. So a long answer, I think, yes, we will see people trying to differentiate themselves, but they've got to pick something that is actually worth differentiating on. And I think that will be coverage rather than 5G. But they might well label it 5G. Why not? Yeah.
Good evening. I'm Piers Clayton. I've just got a question about security, actually, and whether there's a idea that actually cellular connectivity is more secure than Wi-Fi as a premise.
Yeah. So, no, not really. At least in terms of the radio link, the key issue is what happens beyond that. So actually, if you look at security breaches and things like that denial of service attack and so on, that wasn't a breach of security at the radio level. It was a breach at layers above that, lacking password protection and so on, so being able to log into a system. So there's nothing inherently insecure about Wi-Fi, but because it's not managed in the same way as cellular, you don't get the proper professional management system, and therefore you get people setting up Wi-Fi with simple passwords or whatever, and then people can hack in. So that is an issue. My view on that is, I think what we'll move to is a world of trusted Wi-Fi hotspots. So BT Open Zone is a kind of starting point of that. So you kind of know you can log on to BT Open Zone. It's secure because BT have managed that whole environment for you. Yes, you're logging into somebody's home Wi-Fi, but it's a partitioned part of that home Wi-Fi, not something that person can get to, and BT have set it up to be properly managed and secure and so on. Whereas if you just log into this Wi-Fi here, you've got no way of knowing whether there's any kind of security and what that is and whether that's relevant. So I think we will need to move more towards that sort of thing. But I don't think there's anything inherently problematic underlying all of this. And I'm sure that we still get security scares on the internet, even after all these years. I'm sure we'll still get security scares on everything because bad guys will think of new ways to find loopholes, and people will do stuff that's silly because they don't know any better, and it'll take a while for that sort of level of education to flow through.
Thanks.
Robert Kenny, Communications, James. William, do you want to just talk a bit, you've described this decoupling of the hype and lobbyist enthusiasm and so on from the underlying technical reality. Do you want to just talk a bit about how that disconnect has happened and what we can do to prevent the next one?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. So, of course, there always is hype. If you go back to any new technology, it's always hyped. And part of the reason is that that's kind of the only way to generate enough enthusiasm to get everyone to act together and get things off the ground. So I don't think we should worry too much about hype per se, but it needs to sort of be pointing in the right direction. So what's happened here? Why has the hype become disconnected from the right direction of travel? I think it's to some degree down to this strange clock cycle of generations in mobile telephony. So I can't think of anything else that has that kind of cyclical nature to it. The basic internet doesn't. We don't have IPv5, then V6, then V7 every 10 years. It doesn't happen in transport. You don't have a new generation of cars every 10 years or planes or anything else. It seems to be something that is quite specific to the mobile industry. And it's created a sort of a dynamic in the industry that you must start working on the next generation and get it out 10 years hence. Even if you can't think of a good reason for it, you just do it because that's the way the industry cycles through. Now, it's worked fine up until 4G, arguably, although there is an interesting observation that the even number of Gs tend to work pretty well and the odd numbers tend to be disasters. So just to unpick that one slightly, 1G kind of okay, but bit ropey really. 2G came along and fixed all the problems that were known in 1G, such as poor voice quality, lack of security. 3G, leap into the unknown, will do data, didn't really work. 4G fixes the 3G data issue by going to all IP. That works quite well. 5G, leap into the unknown, pretty ropey, doesn't really work. 6G comes along and fixes it. That, that's kind of, but that's a bit of an aside. I think what has happened is the industry has just said, well, we've got to find another G, we've got to find a reason for it. We'll just extrapolate broadly what's happened before. It's always been a 10-fold increase in speed each time, so this is another 10-fold increase in speed. We'll do that. I think the additional dynamic that hasn't helped has been the advent of a whole load of new Far Eastern manufacturers in the form of Samsung and Huawei and others who have piled into this new area. And it's new for them. This is the first generation that they've been involved at the start with. And they don't have the sort of the history, and they've sort of piled in, we can do this even better. Let's go even faster than everyone else, without taking the time to sort of do the backroom conversations and pick up the pulse of the industry. So I think that hasn't helped, and that dynamic has then been picked up by governments and others who want to be 5G and better 5G. Will we solve it? I think hype is always a human tendency, so I think we'll solve that. But I suspect 5G will be a pretty rude awakening to the whole industry, and there'll be a never again kind of moment. And indeed, I think it's possible we will move away from the cyclical nature of generations. We'll start to fragment out to a sort of more general evolution going forwards.
Yeah, that sounds right. You're talking about that sort of step cycle. We once upon a time had that with CPUs. I mean, people used to be able to say, I have a Pentium or I have a 486. I have the foggiest idea what the processor in my computer is now.
No.
We've weaned ourselves off that.
Exactly. They reached a point in time where it got very hard to make them faster. And indeed, actually, you didn't really need to keep going faster anymore. The typical PC, by and large, you got a level of performance that was more than adequate for almost anyone. So the combination of it was very hard, and when it worked just fine, meant that actually you stopped worrying about whether you've got a 400 megahertz 486. And you could argue exactly the same is happening in the mobile world, that it's pretty hard to go faster, and nobody needs it because 20 megabits a second is more than enough. So we've reached that same kind of point where you might expect people to stop fixating about those kind of things and start worrying more about whether the battery is going to burst into flames or whether the screen is sufficiently curvy to be attractive to my mates in the pub.
Thank you, Ian Kane. I'm much more concerned about coverage, and you've said very little about that. What's the interconnection between 5G and the coverage problems we have here or might be experienced in other parts of the world?
Yeah, so like you, I'm very concerned about coverage. But if you look at why do we have not spots, why do we have areas that don't have coverage, it is entirely economic. So there's no technical reason why we haven't got coverage on a particular piece of land. You could go build a base station and deliver coverage. It's not difficult, but it's expensive. And the economics of the industry are such that the mobile operators aren't very keen to spend any more money. And even though we say we're worried about coverage, we tend to buy the cheapest phone contract for the phone we want from whichever operator offers it when we go to the phone shop. And so the mobile operators know that actually they could improve coverage, but it probably wouldn't change sales. If they instead spent the money on a bit more marketing and slightly cheaper phone offers, they would probably get more subscribers. You can ask, why is that? What's happening there? And I think the issue is, by and large, it's just too difficult at the moment for people to know what the best coverage is for them. How do you tell whether a different operator has got better coverage for you? Well, if you ask enough people, you might find somebody who's got a different operator who can tell you it does actually work here. But then what about over there? Are you and your mates all going to get different phone contracts and go on a voyage of discovery around the country? You could, but it's really difficult. So actually, delivering really good personalized coverage information might help people make decisions that are better informed, which might then drive the mobile operators to worry more about that, potentially. And something else I'm doing, I can talk about later maybe, is helping to achieve that. The other thing that changed the economics is just some technology that was much cheaper. So something that provided coverage magically everywhere for no extra cost. Unfortunately, there isn't any of that I've seen at the moment. So you have to do the heavy lifting either with lots of Wi-Fi self-deployed or with mobile operators doing more coverage. So absolutely serious problem, but I don't think 5G at the moment is pointing the right way to address that.
Well, another question from me before I pass over. There was at one time, from my past role in the Oxfordshire Local Enterprise Partnership, I came across the 5G project based at Surrey University, which seemed to be funded primarily by Huawei and not a single US manufacturer involved in the whole of the process, which is a bit weird at the time. But what's happened with that project? Because it's been a few years since I've heard anything about that.
So it still exists. It's called the 5G IC for Innovation Centre. They built a nice shiny building, and they now sit in it. Huawei delivered a few 4G base stations that have sort of ability to do programming type features that have been deployed around the campus that can be tinkered with to try out new solutions. They have a board of companies, as you rightly said. It's a mix of UK operators, a few smaller and larger UK companies, and the likes of Huawei and a few others. It's not clear what they've done. Now, whenever I try and find out, they tend to say, we've got IPR issues, we've done lots of clever things, but our board won't let us talk about them until they've got the IPR squared away. May be true, but not very helpful, really, particularly if you're hoping to feed this into standards bodies and you haven't got there yet. So I don't really know, but the government has been funding it. It's likely to continue to fund it. It has some money for 5G. I think it believes that some of it should go to research centres. That's not a bad, you don't need to send a lot of money in those directions. You never quite know what may come out of it yet. So, still exists. And I think in a way, it shows just how tough a problem this is. They're great guys down at Surrey. In fact, I'm a visiting professor there, so I think it's a good place. But this is really tough stuff. We've kind of optimized the hell out of mobile radio systems for 30 years now. And a lot of the theory suggests that we are really very, very close to fundamental limits in many respects. And doing anything that improves stuff is very, very difficult indeed now. And I think that's part of the problem that they're bumping into. But that's our primary UK research. And there's also a number of other universities. Bristol's got some stuff going on too.
Yeah. Because I noticed at the time that there are no US manufacturers in that, and also, for instance, ARM, as one of the leading British manufacturers, wasn't in there either.
Yeah.
And okay, ARM have been acquired since, but...
So the US manufacturers, well, there aren't that many. So Qualcomm is probably the leading light. Of course, Bell Labs is no longer owned by the US. That was sold off to Alcatel, as was Lucent. Are there any other major US manufacturers? I'm trying to think. Intel. Yeah, so Intel have never really made it into the mobile phone. They've kind of tried and... Apple, yeah, no, that's a good point. Apple don't tend to influence future generations too much. They actually tend to be a little bit behind the curve. So the first iPhone was 2G only at a time when 3G was prevalent. So Apple's view tends to be, let's let the radio technology mature and we'll take it when it's ready and run with it.
Excuse me, they have just taken, it's only a small local license around with Cupertino to
Okay.
5G. They've actually got a little operating license with 5G.
Yeah.
But just in testing.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I wouldn't write them off. Obviously, they're an enormous company with massive influence. Qualcomm, though, are the biggest, I think, the world's biggest chipset supplier into handsets. And so they make lots of noises about 5G. But actually, interestingly, if you dig a bit deeper, what they really say is, we think 4G evolved through what's called LTE Advanced Pro, has got a lot of legs, and that's really where we're running for the next few years. And I think they're right. You know, I think that is basically, there's a lot of room still to tweak and enhance 4G, and that's really where the world's likely to be going. So that's why I don't think you see them playing a really active role in those kind of research establishments, because they're not focused there. But interestingly, I mean, when I first wrote the book, one of the chapters I entitled The Emperor's New Clothes, because it seemed to me that actually it was in nobody's interest to say anything bad about 5G. So if you're a government, the last thing you want to say is, we don't want to be a world leader in 5G, we think it's rubbish. I mean, that doesn't sound good from a government minister point of view. If you're an operator, if you say, 5G is naff, then the regulator's likely to say, well, we won't give you any new spectrum then. You're not playing ball in our country, off you go. If you're a manufacturer and you say, I'm not so sure about 5G, what are your operators going to think? If you're an academic and you say, yeah, it's a bit silly, are you going to get research funding from the European Commission for your next 5G-related project? It's in everybody's interest to talk it up, and that's why you get this kind of, everybody appears to be playing there, but actually as you dig under it, you're not so sure about whether that's really true. I think that's kind of what we see to some degree.
Okay, questions?
Good evening, my name is George.
Hi, George.
Thanks for the presentation. It's really great to hear, let's say, the other side of the story, because most of the industry is always pushing for 5G. Yeah. And actually last week I attended a conference which is 5G World in London.
I was there
so that was briefly a big thing as well. Yeah. So just if you allow me, probably three things. I'm not going to take a long time. The first one, just back on the 5G IC point. I've also been following them for quite a while now. And I think the latest thing that they've done, in a way, is a virtualized core network end-to-end, which was probably a really interesting thing to hear about. And they admit that they have lots of bugs probably in the solution, but they're working on it. And probably the government has allocated around 30 million for them.
Sounds about right.
So that's for the 5G IC in Surrey. The other 2 points, if I may, one is the capacity and the other one is the low latency. So the capacity, I think when you mentioned or showed your curve, probably we're talking about it at this moment of time and as per the percentage of, let's say, traffic usage that we are doing now. So I'm not sure if probably in 5-10 years time there would be a new application that may require really that peak in data traffic usage. So I think might be worth having that infrastructure, even though we're not sure yet what the technology or the application could be that would use all this resources. Sorry? Robots, probably, yeah. So I think one of the 5G, let's say, points or key points is to have a ready network for the future, and then when things come on board, then you can just plug and play, as they say. So this, and the second thing is the low latency or the ultra latency. It's fair to mention the connected car example, but I think also fair to mention probably 2 other examples, such as remote surgery and this kind of mission critical applications. So I wonder what your input is on let's say the other.
No, they're good points. So let's start at the end with remote surgery. I remember early adverts for Motorola's Iridium system that showed polar explorers walking across the pole and using it. And yeah, absolutely. If you want to do polar exploration, Iridium's the thing for you. How many polar explorers are there in the world? That many, maybe? How many people doing remote surgery? Well, maybe a few more than that, but not a lot, frankly. And if they are, hopefully they're not walking down the street whilst they're doing it. Hopefully they're in a hospital somewhere with a big screen and some gloves and things, in which case they're not using cellular. They'll have a fiber optic connection straight to that point. So that, I think, is an incredibly stupid example. But I agree, the whole industry uses it. I don't know why. But I think your more valuable point is, should we build a network now, just in case in 10 years' time there's some wondrous new application that we might need? Well, if we had all the money in the world, why not? But if you go to the CEO of Telefonica and say to him, would you please build a network for 5 years out? It's going to cost you $5 billion. And actually, I can't think of any applications that anyone will pay any more for. But I think you should do it anyway, just in case. He's not going to invest. And I think that's the problem, that unless you've got something that looks like it's worth investing for, you don't make that investment, not as a commercial entity. Governments might decide to just because they want to future-proof things, but actually governments don't build mobile networks. So until you can see something that is a commercially viable investment, you don't do it, just for the just-in-case scenario. Will we find other stuff? Well, I think the thing to come back to is that actually the only thing that moves the needle on mobile traffic is video. Everything else is utterly irrelevant. So when you get to this peak of my curve, 98% of the traffic on the network is video. Robots don't do video. They don't need it. They might send a bit of telemetry information or whatever, but they don't do video. Autonomous cars don't do video. They might have a video camera within them, but they don't need to send video anywhere. They can process it and send a, look, I've spotted this kind of thing information. In fact, it's only people that do video. And if you're already doing 2 or 3 hours a day of the stuff, you haven't got time to do anymore. So I would contend it's really, really hard to think of anything that would move the needle. Certainly, robots and so on absolutely will be connected, but they're in that 0.03% of volume of traffic type of stuff that's going on. So I don't think there's anything we can even feasibly point to that at the moment would need that sort of network. And that sort of network is so expensive, I don't think you'd do it until you had something that you could actually say, this is something people will pay more for. And that's the issue. And I think until people see that, they won't build it. The sort of build it just in case mantra. As I said, if you had unlimited funds, you'd do that. But frankly, if the government's got unlimited funds, I'd rather they built more hospitals than a super fast network.
Sorry to have a second go, but I did want to quickly come in, if I may, on the remote surgery, because this is one of my absolute favourites. Remote surgery is repeatedly used as a justification for all sorts of telecoms investments. It's been used to justify fibre to the home. It is a classic of the type where it's an application invented as justification not by the user, but by the network or the equipment manufacturers. And I had the conversation about remote surgery with an actual surgeon, which I don't think anybody in the industry has done before. I said, look, our industry is very excited about remote surgery. What do you think about that? He said, it's a stupid idea. He said that the problem with remote surgery is that if the patient has some kind of seizure, the fact that you're doing something really clever with their liver, with a robot designed for fixing the liver, doesn't help you at all when you need to do emergency cardiac massage. The liability for surgeons in doing remote surgery is so massive, it is never going to happen except in a tiny number of special cases. So I love that example because it is the perfect case of an telecoms industry-driven application. When you actually speak to the potential users of it, they say, forget it, no way. So glad you brought it up.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. About it, but it's
Yeah. And you know, you're right to bring it up because everyone talks about it. And as you said, Robert, in a way, it's a classic example of how this is a solution looking for a problem. And indeed, you know, when I go and talk to autonomous vehicle manufacturers, and I say, what about this sub-millisecond latency? They say, actually, our biggest concern is how the car handles itself in a multi-story car park when it's got no connectivity. What the hell does it do? It doesn't know where it is. The mapping system might not help very much. It's got to try and find a parking space. That's a far bigger issue for us than having millisecond connectivity. So again, the telecoms industry has postulated a need that doesn't really exist. And maybe sooner or later some need will appear, and maybe it will eventually be able to justify something else. But at the moment, I think we're a long way from that.
Hi, my name's James Cannon. I spent 20 years running around in green jeans talking to people all over the world.
Okay.
My understanding is the mobile phone networks are generally on very narrow frequencies. And one of the things you experience if you actually have to do it in the middle of nowhere is that actually by changing frequencies you get further reach. And there are obviously things you can do, like you can improve the size of the antenna, you can stand on top of a hill or top of a car, all of those sort of things. Surely some sort of infill with other frequencies, and you know, phones are now technical enough that you could actually have a frequency agile.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that, you know, for instance in Western Australia, which I know quite well, they actually have special phones from the middle of nowhere where they've got no more masts, no more communication, but just the phones will reach further. And what your thoughts were about talking about 5G and improving the coverage with the existing masts.
So everything you say is perfectly correct. Actually, the number of frequency bands has in fact burgeoned over the last few years, and in the 4G specification, there's now over 40 different frequency bands. The latest iPhone supports 19 of them, I think, which is pretty impressive. Certainly here in the UK, at the moment, there's in use right now, there's 800 megahertz, 900 megahertz, 1500 is just coming into use, 1800, 1900, 2100, 2600, 3400 vaguely for that. So there is a broad range of frequencies, and the lower frequencies deliver much better connectivity. And that's kind of what was the big deal with the 4G 800 megahertz auction, was the ability to move that further. Delivering even more lower frequency spectrum would be great for rural areas. And you know, if only 5G were doing that, that would be fantastic. Actually, it's not. It's a kind of thing where things like TV Whitespaces, I think another place close to mine, would actually bring some potential benefits for those areas. And yes, you could imagine phones that are much better, either because they use particular frequencies, or actually most phones have got really rubbish antennas these days because they have to be hidden behind curvy screens and shiny backs. And so, you know, a phone that had a really good antenna stuck out the top, like those old ones you pulled up, wouldn't be very sexy, but would actually work fantastically better, would extend your range. So I think there's a lot of stuff that could be done. But again, there's nothing in the 5G development at the moment that I see that is moving in that direction. Now, you could start up a new group within 5G and say this group is all about developing a new system for rural coverage. That would be a really good idea, but at the moment I just don't see it happening.
Hi, David Harris here. Putting my marketing hat on and looking at what one sees, whenever you get an industry which is kind of stuck, you often get people trying to disrupt that.
Yep.
So even something as modern as disruptive as the mobile industry, maybe it's time for some other type of disruption there. 5G may pretend to be that, but it also, because it's got a lot of marketing, there's some money behind it somewhere. You follow the money, find out where that is and who's doing that. Presumably someone there is trying to convince people that there is a disruption going on to make it different. Do you sense any of that happening? And if not, is it time to work out which heads to put together to see what could be a real disruption?
So actually, I think most of the money within 5G is quite the opposite. It's the industry trying to convince everyone that there's not a disruption and that the same cyclical 10-year better, faster is just going to keep happening. I agree with you, actually. I think the industry needs a disruption now. It's reached a point that is not really a very happy point for the industry. It's not profitable. It's not working well for consumers. So I think we do need disruption. And I think my suspicion of the failure of 5G in however it fails. It may just fail because it proves to be a damn squib or whatever. I think will open the door to all sorts of other thinking. If I had to pick anything, I would pick, for example, something a bit like Google's Project Fi. I don't know if those of you come across Project Fi, but the concept is that you sign up to Google as your cellular provider. They deliver you a Pixel phone with a special version of Android on it that is optimized to work really well across Wi-Fi and to fall back to cellular. So actually, it looks like an ordinary cellular phone, it works like an ordinary cellular phone, but it tries to spend as much of its time as possible connected on Wi-Fi. And then it has 2 operators it can fall back to in the States if it doesn't find Wi-Fi. But it does all this seamlessly in the background with Google's pre-approved Wi-Fi hotspots. Google can offer that for less than a cellular operator because most of the traffic goes over Wi-Fi. But the coverage is better than any one cellular operator because you get the combination of Wi-Fi and 2 US operators. So it's cheaper and better and is pretty disruptive in a way because it then leads through a model of Wi-Fi with cellular underneath. Now, Google aren't pushing hard on that because they don't tend to do that sort of thing. They tend to sort of show the way a bit and then let others do it. But all the updates to Android are now available for that. So that could be the sort of thing. It may not be exactly like that, but that could be the sort of thing that disrupts the whole industry and moves people to a world where actually they start buying a connectivity bundle for Wi-Fi and IoT and cellular from a non-mobile operator. That changes the whole dynamics of the market. Everything gets shaken up. Something else pops out the other end. So I do think that there will be disruption to the current model. I think it will be caused by 5G eventually failing in some way, shape or form. And we'll see how that plays out.
Let's hope that this conversation triggers some of that.
Yeah, I published my book because I was getting so frustrated with the industry that I figured that I may well be committing professional suicide, but if I didn't do it, I would just go slightly insane, sitting through another 5G conference where everyone was saying stuff that was utterly crazy. Since then, there has been a gradual change in sentiment. Now, that may be completely coincidental. I'm not claiming that I've influenced the world, but it does appear that some of these discussions around is 5G really utopia are now not just having to happen behind closed doors, but are starting to happen publicly. And that will eventually lead to, I think, a better world. But there's still a lot of people. No one from Huawei is going to stand up and say, I've got doubts about 5G. But some of the operators are just starting to do it now.
Right.
Yes, must be food time.
Thank you, William.